Bom, agora chegou a hora do nosso primeiro palestrante. Ele é vice-presidente do Mises Institute, é editor do Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, especialista em teoria monetária, economia comparativa e de economia austríaca, e história do ensinamento econômico. É coautor do curso de economia austríaca, disponível em DVD, que vai ser transformado em livro. O nome é Fundamentals of Economic Analysis. Nessa exposição, ele vai explicar para a gente quem foram, afinal, esses são considerados os maiores expoentes da Escola Austríaca de Economia. Eu peço aí os aplausos para Joe Salerno, nosso primeiro expositor.
May I move this? I want to place this here. Okay.
Put it here and I will save it. Okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Not very.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am deeply honored and really thrilled to be here as the opening speaker of the first Brazilian conference in Austrian economics. When I first became acquainted with Austrian economics as a college student in the early 1970s, I met no other Austrian for 2 years. I remember reading Murray Rothbard's book, America's Great Depression, while I worked as a janitor sweeping floors. I would sneak off on my own and read the book in a small janitor's room. Mike? Okay. As I was saying before Mark Thornton interrupted me, I would sneak off on my own and read the book in a small janitor's room. I felt so alone. I was alone. I was hiding from my boss and reading a book by myself in a closet. I could never have imagined back then that today I would be speaking to an audience of hundreds in Brazil about Mises and Rothbard. 6 months after I attended a conference in Spain on the works of the Spanish scholastics. I want to thank Elio Beltro and the dedicated staff of the Mises Institute of Brazil for making such a wonderful event possible. For me, this is indeed a dream come true. Now there are even more people who will be reading Austrian economics with me out in the open. Okay. Who were Mises and Rothbard? The short answer is they were vocational economists in an age of professionalization. In this lecture, I will explain that this answer is the key to understanding the way they lived their lives and the intellectual contributions that they made. Mises and Rothbard were born 2 generations apart, and they were worlds apart in cultural background and personal temperament. But despite these differences, they shared important similarities, both in their intellectual attitudes and in their scholarly careers. Both men were creative geniuses who constructed an imposing system of economic theory. They both worked in virtual isolation, outside of mainstream academia, during very productive periods of their lives. Both published great treatises on economic science at crucial turning points in economic thought. These treatises saved Austrian economics and sound economics in general from falling into oblivion. Both Mises and Rothbard were passionate and intransigent seekers of truth who never deviated from Karl Menger's original vision of the economy as the outcome of the valuations and choices of individual human beings. The most important similarity they shared, however, was that they were both vocational economists in an era when economics was becoming increasingly professionalized. What is a vocational economist? And what qualities distinguish him from a professional economist? The dictionary defines vocation as the work or function to which a person is called, a mode of life or employment regarded as requiring dedication. Ludwig von Mises defined vocation by distinguishing between 2 different kinds of labor. The first he called introversive labor, and the second extroversive labor. You will not find these precise words or their equivalent in an English or Portuguese dictionary. Mises coined these terms in order to address an important distinction in human action. Introversive labor is a labor undertaken solely for its own sake and not as a means to another end. Extroversive labor, in contrast, is performed because the individual prefers income or other rewards that he can earn by working to the pleasure of leisure that he sacrifices. Mises described the two most conspicuous examples of introversive labor. The first is a search for truth and knowledge pursued for its own sake, and not as a means of improving one's own efficiency and skill for other tasks. The second is true sport, which one practices without any desire for social recognition or success. Mises always referred to mountain climbing, which was one of his favorite pastimes, as an example of true sport. The effort expended by the scientific truth seeker, that is, we scholars, or the mountain climber, does not involve the usual disutility of labor. The labor itself is the source of satisfaction. So from the point of view of the science of human action, seeking truth in economics, when it is pursued as an end in itself, directly satisfies the scientific researcher or scholar. It is, therefore, a vocation. Now, the search for new truth in economics requires many things in addition to intellectual efforts of the vocational economist. It also requires complementary goods like books, journals, research facilities, conferences, clerical assistance, and other kinds of labor. Most of these things must be purchased on the market. In addition, the vocational economist requires the kinds of consumer goods, various kinds of consumer goods, to sustain his existence and give him the health and the energy to carry on his research. These things, too, must be purchased on the market. The founding members of the Austrian school did not pursue research for monetary gain or because they were seeking professional recognition or as an influence on public policy. According to Mises, when Menger, von Bawerk, and Wieser began their scientific careers, and now I'm quoting, they considered it as their vocation to put economic theory on a sound basis, and they dedicated themselves entirely to this cause, unquote. Note the words that Mises used in this statement, vocation and dedicated. These three eminent Austrians, therefore, were not economists by profession, but by vocation. The vocational economist takes a position in the university or works in some other profession, such as banking, journalism, industry, or government. He does so in order to obtain the concrete means necessary to sustain his effort to discover new truths or to teach and apply established truths in his economic research and writing. The professional economist also works in the same jobs, but his ultimate aims are very different. He seeks to accumulate wealth, draw praise from his peers, achieve public fame, or shape political policies. Most likely, he aims at a combination of these ends. Thus, the difference between the vocational economist and the professional economist is not their objective method of earning a living, but the subjective ends that they aim at. But despite the subjective element involved, the two kinds of economists can easily be distinguished from each other because they differ sharply in the views they express towards the truth content and the perceived rewards of economic research. They also have a deep respect for the past and for past contributions of economics because they believe that these contain truth. As vocational economists, both Mises and Rothbard display deep respect for the earlier contributions in the tradition of sound economics. This was particularly true with regard to their mentors. Mises' mentor was the great von Bawerk. Mises himself was Rothbard's mentor and the person to whom Rothbard dedicated his treatise, Man, Economy, and State. Not only did Mises and Rothbard recognize the contributions of their predecessors in the development of economic science, they also actively use these contributions in their own work. Mises was one of the leading proponents of the Austrian subjective theory of value. Sure. Okay. Should I get down? Now, this subjective theory of value had replaced the objective cost of production theory held by the British classical school of David Hume, Adam Smith, and David Ricardo. Mises, however, further developed subjective value theory by correcting the founders of the subjective value doctrine, Menger and Bombaverk, who had not fully realized that utility and value could not be measured and quantified. Mises demonstrated that value was strictly ordinal and involved a ranking of goods by individual actors. As such, Mises argued, values could be neither added together nor compared between different individuals. Mises then formulated a theory of monetary calculation based on this subjective theory of value. He showed how the subjective and ordinal valuations of individual consumers are transformed by the free market into a system of objective and cardinal prices. This system of prices is used by entrepreneurs to calculate their profits and losses and to rationally allocate resources. Mises went on to show that under socialism, where private property and the means of production was absent, and the state controlled all capital goods, exchange and market prices could not exist. Without real market prices, economic calculation would be impossible. Under socialism, therefore, no objective guide would exist for allocating scarce resources, and production would be chaotic, and human life and civilization would come to a quick end as we know it. All of this was derived by Mises from the original subjective theory of value. As Mises revealed in his memoirs, notes, and recollections, it was only after he already was a mature economist of nearly 50 years old that he felt competent to criticize his masters, Menger and Bombaverk. And when he did criticize them, he was careful to emphasize that the problem lay with inconsistencies between certain statements they made in their expositions and books and the correct fundamental principles of their subjective value doctrine. Mises not only drew from the intellectual legacy of his predecessors and mentors, but also learned from the new ideas and criticisms of his colleagues and students, whom he often generously credited with inspiring improvements in his own theories. With respect to his path-breaking theory of money and credit, Mises wrote, "I owe a great deal to the stimulation of the works of B.M. Anderson, T.E. Gregory, Dennis Robertson, Albert Hahn, Friedrich Hayek, and Fritz Machlup. They induced me to reconsider my theory and improve its presentation. I learned genuinely from the writings of these men." So Mises was an incredibly humble man intellectually. When Rothbard published Man, Economy, and State, Mises reviewed it and enthusiastically endorsed it. He called Rothbard's work an epical contribution to the general science of human action. He then went on to declare, quote, "Henceforth, all essential studies in these branches of knowledge will have to take account of the theories and criticisms expounded by Dr. Rothbard," unquote. Mises gave high praise to Rothbard's treatise, despite the fact that parts of the book were intended to correct and improve upon the system of economic theory that Mises himself had presented earlier in Human Action. One area in particular where Rothbard explicitly disagreed with Mises was the theory of monopoly. Mises had conceded that the formulation of a monopoly price above the competitive price was theoretically conceivable in an unhampered market, although highly unlikely to occur in practice. Rothbard argued, to the contrary, that the distinction between a monopoly price and a competitive price was conceptually meaningless in a free market economy. Now, Mises was once asked his opinion of Rothbard's disagreement with his theory of monopoly price. By Joaquin Rieg, the Spanish translator of Human Action. This occurred at the Mont Pelerin Society meeting in 1965. Margit von Mises said that her husband had replied, quote, "Whatever Rothbard has written in this work is of the greatest importance," unquote. However, the Spanish economist Jesus Huerta de Soto has reported that when Rieg himself used to recount this incident, he would quote Mises' response as, quote, "I agree with every word Professor Rothbard has written on the subject," unquote. Whichever account of the incident is correct, the point is that even in his later years, Mises remained open to the criticisms of his students when they improved upon his own work. Rothbard, too, treated his mentor and his predecessors in economics with uncommon deference and respect. He often referred to himself only as a student of Mises and characterized his own original contributions to economics as attempts to advance what he called the Misesian paradigm. The first time Rothbard ever directly criticized Mises in public was in his classic paper on praxeology, value judgments, and public policy, which he presented at the North American Conference on Austrian Economics, the first North American Conference on Austrian Economics, held in South Royalton, Vermont. The year was 1974, and Rothbard was already nearly 50 years old. He was already a prolific author and one of the most accomplished and recognized Austrian economists in the world besides Hayek. Yet, after his talk ended, I remember him confiding to a few of us in attendance that he was still a little shaky, unsettled, or disturbed from having criticized his mentor publicly for the first time. What Rothbard had done in this paper, correctly in my judgment, was to point out that Mises' utilitarian social philosophy was incapable of supporting value-free judgments about the effects of economic policies on social welfare. Rothbard did not simply dismiss or ridicule Mises' position, but subjected it to the careful scrutiny and analysis that a great scholar's work is entitled to. I was fortunate to count Murray Rothbard as a close friend for over 20 years. So perhaps you will indulge me some personal recollections that reveal his great intellectual humility and his respect for his younger followers like myself. Some may have called us little punks. On one occasion, I met Murray for a lunch at his favorite delicatessen in New York City. It was in the early 1990s when he was working on his 2-volume masterpiece on the history of economic thought. Over lunch, he eagerly told me about the many new discoveries he had made, the unjustly obscure economists he had discovered, how one apparently minor economist was actually a brilliant movement organizer, although his influence was evil, as Murray would say, how modern psychobabble, which Rothbard usually detested, was actually useful in explaining the thought of a famous classical economist. And on he went, in his rapid-fire, New York style of speaking. He gleefully told me about the novel interpretations and critiques he was developing that would puncture the overblown reputations of some of the most venerable figures in economic thought. While he spoke, I rarely said anything, because I was fascinated by what I was learning, and I wanted to absorb every new idea and insight. I was also stunned by the breadth and the depth of his knowledge about a subject that he had not previously written much on. He must have mistaken my silence as a sign of boredom, because after about an hour, he suddenly stopped and sheepishly apologized for going on at such length. I assured him that I was not bored and urged him to continue. To my delight, he merrily resumed his discourse for another 2 hours. Later, I thought to myself, how could he think that I ever would want to interrupt him? Here he was, a creative genius who was giving me a private seminar on a work in progress that was sure to be a future classic when it was published. I will relate one more personal memory. In 1990, I published an article entitled Ludwig von Mises as a Social Rationalist in the Review of Economics, a journal edited by Rothbard. The article presented an interpretation of Mises' views on the problem of socialist calculation and on the function of the price system, which differed radically from the common interpretation held by leading Austrian economists, including Israel Kirzner and to some extent Rothbard himself. In particular, I argue that Mises' position in the socialist calculation debate and his understanding of the function of the price system differed significantly from his student Hayek's. I withheld the paper for about 6 months after it was completed because I was fearful of how it would be received. I finally sent it to Rothbard, and to my great relief, he responded quickly with a long letter highly praising the paper. Here's part of what he wrote. And I quote this because he's written very similar letters to many younger scholars. It's a wonderful, superb advance and breakthrough, not only in the history of economic thought, but also in economic theory itself. Reading the article was just a joy. In a sense, this sort of breakthrough experience is something like the joy of an intellectual conversion on reading libertarian stuff or Austrian economics for the first time, where the person develops your own feelings. And so I felt for a long time that Hayek and Hayekianism was on the wrong track, but I have never been able to articulate it. You've done it. Unquote. Rothbard concluded this letter by perfectly summarizing the attitude that a vocational economist takes toward new ideas, even when these ideas come from a younger scholar of much less significance and accomplishment. Wrote Rothbard, I welcome change and advances in Austrian theory, provided they are true, that they work from within the basic Misesian paradigm. Just as I think that I advanced beyond Mises in developing the Misesian paradigm, people like Hans Hoppe and yourself have developed the paradigm still further, and great, unquote. The point is, I was not alone in receiving such enthusiastic words of encouragement from Rothbard, who was always eager to recognize the author of even a modest contribution to the search for truth. And you did not have to be a card-carrying Austrian to receive such effusive praise from Rothbard. Murray welcomed and published many papers by fellow travelers and non-Austrians who contributed to the advancement of Austrian scholarship. With respect for tradition, the respect for tradition that characterized Mises and Rothbard was motivated by their pursuit of truth. The sciences, and especially the social sciences, do not progress in linear fashion, smoothly discarding erroneous conceptions and theories and replacing them with new truths about reality. The history of economic thought is marked by misleading detours, dead ends, and prolonged periods of retrogression away from the truth. That is why Mises and Rothbard treated the history of thought as a living part of economic science. It was an essential part of their mental equipment in the process of conceiving sound new theories. And let me give you a few examples. Mises formulated his theory of the business cycle by integrating contributions from a diverse group of his predecessors. These included the theory of the international specie flow mechanism originated by Hume and Ricardo, the business cycle theory outlined by the mid-19th century British currency school, the distinction between the natural and loan rates of interest developed by the Swedish economist Wicksell, and finally, the capital and interest theory of his own teacher, Bombaverk. Even Mises' boldest departures from received economic theory and method were stimulated by the thinking of past economists. Take, for example, Mises' argument that economics is a science of human action based on a priori, that is, non-experimental reasoning. Mises credited the work of several generations of scholars in which this view was more or less developed. He mentioned by name many completely different thinkers. The classical economists, Nassau Sr., Cairns, and John Stuart Mill. The British banker and essayist, Walter Bagehot. The Austrian economists, Menger and Friedrich von Wieser. The sociologist, Max Weber. And Mises' own contemporary, Lionel Robbins of the London School of Economics. We also have the example of the step-by-step method that Mises applied to analyzing the effects of increases in the supply of money on prices and incomes. This analysis led Mises to the radical conclusion that Irving Fisher and other contemporary supporters of the neoclassical quantity theory were incorrect in claiming that a change in the supply of money, all other things equal, leads to a direct and proportional change of the price level. Using his step-by-step method, Mises demonstrated beyond doubt that a change in the money supply causes prices of different goods to change at different times and unevenly, and therefore causes redistributions of income and wealth, and then changes in the pattern of the demands for various goods and services. Thus, a change in the money supply could not possibly cause all prices to change at the same time in the same proportion. But Mises' theory was not completely new. He credited the classical economist J.E. Cairnes for having outlined in 1873 the step-by-step process by which the discovery of new gold mines in Australia brought about permanent redistributions of income and changes in relative prices internationally. This occurred as the new gold flowed through international balances of payments of first one country and then the next, and affected the money supply of these countries at different times and in different order. And long before Cairnes wrote, Richard Cantillon used the same method to analyze the effects of changes in the money supply, in a treatise that he published in 1755, and a treatise which Mises was familiar with. Many of Rothbard's advances in economic theory were also founded on past contributions in the literature. Possibly the most important contribution of Man, Economy, and State is the comprehensive theory of production that covers 5 chapters and 300 pages. While writing this treatise, Rothbard had discovered that he had to reconstruct Austrian production theory. In a progress report on his treatise that he wrote to the people that were funding him, he wrote the following: Mises has very little detail on production theory, unquote. Rothbard developed his theory by integrating the structure of production analysis developed by Wicksell and Hayek with the pure time preference theory of Mises and Frankfurter. Both of these lines of thought originated in Bombawerk. However, in Human Action, Mises had ignored structure of production analysis, presumably because of its association with Bombawerk's fallacious notion of a measurable average period of production. Rothbard searched the contemporary literature for new ideas and insights as carefully as he had scrutinized the writings of his predecessors. Man, Economy, and State contains citations of over 150 books, journals, conference proceedings, government reports, dissertations, policy reports, and monographs that appeared between 1949, when Human Action was written, and 1962, when Man, Economy, and State was published. Rothbard's deep engagement with the contemporary literature paid off as he discovered that many of these works contained ideas that helped him to clarify, correct, and advance Austrian theory. And he eagerly integrated these contributions into his own work. So he did not just depend on past Austrians. One example is his critique, or another example is his critique of perfect competition and monopolistic competition doctrines, and his formulation of a positive theory of competition as a dynamic process. Here, Rothbard favorably cited the contributions of a number of mainstream economists. He singled out a book on quality and competition written by an obscure economist, Lawrence Abbott, and he gave this book special praise. He characterized it as, quote, one of the outstanding theoretical works of recent years. Indeed, the theory of rivalrous competition developed by Rothbard is clearly influenced by Abbott's arguments on the central importance of the qualitative dimensions of competition. As I already mentioned, the vocational economist may not earn his living by teaching in an academic institution. Mises worked for the Austrian Chamber of Commerce for 24 years, during which he taught as an unpaid part-time professor at the University of Vienna. He did not obtain a regular, full-time university position until he was over 50 years old. and had already established his reputation as one of the most eminent economists in Europe. Rothbard was being supported by foundation grants during the entire time that he was writing two of his most important works, Man, Economy, and State, and America's Great Depression. He did not receive an academic appointment until he was 40 years old, and it was at a technical school of engineering that offered no undergraduate degree or graduate program in economics. Now, the modern professional economist typically occupies a position in a large research-oriented university. Vocational economists in the modern world may also, but seldom do, obtain such positions. They tend to work in smaller liberal arts colleges and in professional schools that emphasize teaching, or they hold jobs outside of academia. But how they earn their pay is not an important difference between the vocational economist and the professional economist. An essential difference between the two kinds of economists is the role played by truth in motivating and shaping their research activities. Vocational economists, as I said, are truth seekers. The discovery of truth is the prime motivation, the guide, the reward for their research. Vocational economists, like Mises and Rothbard, are not afraid to use unfashionable terms like truth, law, inexorable, immutable, universal, when characterizing economic concepts and theories. In his treatise, Mises spoke of, quote, the operation of inexorable economic law, unquote. You'd be laughed at in modern universities if you said something like this. He described economics, quote, as the theory of all human action, the general science of the immutable categories of action and of their operation under all thinkable special conditions under which man acts, unquote. Finally, he asserted, the teachings of praxeology and economics are true for every human action without regard to its underlying motives, causes, and goals, unquote. For Rothbard, economics was a body of immutable and universal laws that are logically derived from the fact that people employ means to attain their most desired ends. Thus, Rothbard wrote, quote, all these elaborated laws of economics are absolutely true. Economics does furnish existential laws, unquote. Rothbard described the purpose of his treatise, Man, Economy, and State, as, quote, slowly and logically to build on the basic axioms an integrated and coherent edifice of economic truth, unquote. Now, contrast these statements by Mises and Rothbard with that of Paul Samuelson, the exemplar of the modern professional economists. Samuelson once declared, and I'm quoting from him, I can claim in talking about modern economics, I am talking about me, unquote. And I say truer words have never been spoken, because Samuelson manifested in the highest degree all the qualities of the modern professional economist. Samuelson was a logical positivist of the crudest kind. He believed good theories are simply economical descriptions of the complex facts of reality. His words. Such theories, according to Samuelson, are supposed to more or less accurately represent facts that are currently observed or likely to be observed in the future. In other words, Samuelson's positivist conception of theoretical research rested on the elementary logical fallacy that non-repeatable historical facts can reveal the causal laws that operate and interact to produce a unique and complex economic event at a later moment in history. Now, why would Samuelson have embraced such nonsense? He explained, quote, not for philosophical reasons, but purely out of long experience in doing economics that other people will like and that I will like, unquote. Okay, so he liked to theorize in this way. Samuelson and Solow, his co-author, their formulation of the now discredited Phillips curve, which postulated a stable trade-off between inflation and unemployment, is a good example of such theorizing in action. Without doubt, the Phillips curve for a time was well liked by Samuelson, Solow, and other professional economists, and was even used by government policymakers. But its truth content has proven to be exactly nil by the worldwide stagflation that developed in the 1970s. However, the professional economists need not worry too much about such obvious failures of their models to yield true knowledge about reality. According to Samuelson, His reward for pursuing economic research lies elsewhere. And this is what Samuelson writes about why he and other professional economists do economic research. In the long run, the economic scholar works for the only coin worth having, our own applause, unquote. Along the same lines, Samuelson describes scientists, including professional economists, as being, quote, as avaricious and competitive as Smithian businessmen, referring to Adam Smith's businessmen. He goes on, the coin they seek is not apples, nuts, and yachts, nor is it coin itself, or power, as that term is ordinarily understood. Scholars seek fame. The fame they seek is fame with their peers, the other scientists whom they respect and whose respect they strive for. Unquote. Samuelson's account of the reward sought after by modern professional economists, if it is accurate, clearly reveals that their research is not governed primarily by a search for truth. Okay. They just want to hear people clapping, people that they like. But Samuelson's view is not completely accurate. The professional economist does indeed toil to obtain position, power, and income, mainly by means of the state. A more accurate account than Samuelson's of the goals sought by the professional economist was given by Mises in his description of Werner Sombart. Sombart was the leader of the third generation of the German historical school, which was viciously anti-Austrian and anti-theoretical. The school was already in decline after World War I, but still controlled the prestigious university chairs. German economists, or German economics, had been professionalized in the late 19th century, which really means brought under the control of the state. And this was long before economics in the English-speaking countries. Sombart was perhaps a consummate professional economist, and Mises knew him personally. The personality that emerges in Mises' entertaining portrayal of Sombart is the very antithesis of the vocational economist. Now I'm going to quote Mises at a little bit of length about Sombart. Werner Sombart was the great master of his set. He was known as a pioneer in economic history, economic theory, and sociology. And he enjoyed reputation as an independent man because he had once aroused the ire of Kaiser Wilhelm. Professor Sombart really deserved the recognition of his colleagues because to the greatest degree, he really combined in his person all their shortcomings. He never knew any ambition other than to draw attention to himself and to make money. He was always seeking public applause. He wrote paradoxes because he could then count on success. He was highly gifted, but at no time did he endeavor to work and think seriously. Of the occupational disease of German professors, delusions of grandeur, Hans Hoppe isn't here, is he? Sombart had acquired a huge share. When it was fashionable to be a Marxian, he professed Marxism. When Hitler came to power, he wrote that the Führer receives his orders from God, unquote. So that's Mises' description of the professional economist. Now this brings us to the role of the state in the development of the economics profession. In Human Action, Mises drew a perceptive distinction between vocational economists and professional economists, which invoked the interventionist state. Wrote Mises, the early economists devoted themselves to the study of the problems of economics. In lecturing and writing books, they were eager to communicate to their fellow citizens the results of their thinking, in order to make sound policies prevail in the conduct of civic affairs. They never conceived of economics as a profession. Now he's referring to the great classical economists. Now, continuing, Mises says, the development of a profession of economists is an offshoot of interventionism. The professional economist is a specialist who is instrumental in designing various measures of government interference with business. He is an expert in the field of economic legislation, which today invariably aims at hindering the operation of the market economy. Unquote. Let me expand on Mises' brilliant insight. The professionalization of a scientific discipline, particularly a social science like economics, almost always proceeds hand in hand with the expansion of government intervention. The reason for this inevitable connection rests on two facts. On the one hand, as Mises pointed out, the state requires a class of intellectuals and specialists to design and provide rationalizations for various interventions into the market economy. On the other hand, those intellectuals who seek a regular income are always ready to serve the state's needs, because the ability of an intellectual to earn his living on the free market by researching and writing is always uncertain, at best. As the interventionist state expands, it reinforces the need for trained experts. The university system obliges by initiating and expanding graduate programs that will provide such personnel. In exchange, the universities receive increased government subsidies. The lucrative positions in these programs are naturally given to those economists who are most eager to professionalize, because they are the ones who are most active and outspoken in their support of government intervention. In the U.S., the most extreme case of domestic interventionism occurred during the two world wars of the 20th century. It was therefore no surprise that the movement to professionalize American economics, which began in the 1880s, experienced great progress during these war crises. For when the state goes to war, it needs professional experts to plan and direct the massive mobilization of the resources it requires. This translates into high-paying and prestigious positions for economic experts and specialists in the bureaus and advisory boards of the government planning apparatus that centrally directs the war economy. Now, these wartime experiences led economists to recognize the potentially great material benefits that they would gain from a permanent alliance between their profession and the centralized American state. They responded by formally reorganizing the discipline and reshaping its educational methods and requirements to suit the prospective needs of the emerging Cold War national security state. Many new sub-disciplines of economics emerged during the Cold War era. Game theory, linear programming, national income accounting, input-output analysis, growth theory, development economics, all these were designed to serve the needs of the interventionist and imperialist American state. Unfortunately, this proliferation of specialized fields led to a disintegration of economic theory. This was signified by the disappearance of the general economics treatise. In fact, no such treatises were published aside from Human Action and Man, Economy, and State after World War II. No longer was there an integrated system of general economic principles that were held in common and applied to the analysis of all policies and problems by those who call themselves economists. Now, each little subfield of research had its own special theory, which was more or less sealed off from general economic theory. Even general theory itself was now divided into microeconomics and macroeconomics. The disintegration of economics was compounded by the post-war trend toward positivism. However, the unrealistic theoretical models constructed by professional economists in their specialized fields can never assist us in understanding the essential laws governing the market economy. For as Mises pointed out, quote, the economist must never be a specialist. In dealing with any problem, he must always fix his gaze upon the whole system. Economics does not allow of breaking up into special branches. It invariably deals with the interconnectedness with all the phenomena of action, unquote. Our discussion thus far leads to an important general point. The economics profession is a fiat phenomenon in the same sense as inconvertible paper money. Neither would or could exist on a market free of a specific pattern of government intervention. Government cannot directly command and coerce new paper money into existence. Government must first impose a series of interventionist measures, such as legal tender laws, bank holidays that allow banks to not convert their promissory notes and deposits into gold. Also, a refusal to pay gold clauses in private contracts or to enforce gold clauses. the banning of private property and gold, and so on. All of these interventions were necessary before a fiat paper money could arise. Now, the same is true of the emergence of the economics profession. Government has no power to directly design and establish a profession and to create its peculiar customs, conventions, research culture, and institutional infrastructure. Nonetheless, a natural vocation like economics can be transformed into a profession as a result of the distortion of market processes caused by wars, political subsidy and control of higher education, and the establishment of centralized bureaus and agencies to institute and oversee economic interference and intervention. The medical profession, for example, is a natural profession that would exist on a free market because it has a natural clientele willing to pay for its services. The economics profession, along with most other social sciences professions, is a fiat profession that has no market clientele. It would only exist as a truth-seeking vocation in the absence of particular historical pattern of government intervention. So to sum up, the vocational economist, those of us who follow Mises and Rothbard, strives to master the system of economic theory as handed down by the great system builders and innovators of the past. Once this mastery is achieved, then, depending on his ability, the vocational economist is prepared either to apply this theoretical system, to contribute a few innovations to it, or to present a thoroughgoing reformulation of the entire system. The latter was what Mises and Rothbard did. But there are very few individuals who are capable of doing this. Moreover, regardless of which path is taken, the vocational economist is driven forward by a thirst for truth which is never satisfied. He seeks to know more and more about what Rothbard called, quote, the structure of reality as embodied in economic law, unquote. Furthermore, the labor he performs for livelihood, regardless of the field, is merely a means to this and other consumption ends that rank very high on his value scale. All other things equal, he's indifferent toward a position in academia, except as it provides a more efficient method of pursuing his vocation. Public acclaim and recognition by his peers, if they come, are not sought after by him, but are, at most, valued byproducts of his activities. Finally, the vocational economist measures progress in his discipline by the quantity and quality of minds that have mastered economic theory. Because his own search for truth is facilitated by subjecting his work to the critical evaluation of others pursuing the same calling. In contrast, the professional economist aims in his research activities at a number of external ends. As I mentioned, these include recognition by his colleagues, public fame, intellectual influence in shaping government policies, professional advancement and prestige, and of course, power and money. To a great extent, these ends are attainable only with government subsidies, and so he naturally supports an expansive and interventionist state. His natural home is in the large research universities that are subsidized or directly controlled by government. He continually returns there between his appointments in government service, statist think tanks, or international bureaucracies. He welcomes the increase of the sheer number of bodies and graduate programs because it means higher salaries and less teaching for him. He especially welcomes and desires the expansion of opportunities to obtain income and positions of power in advising the state. As Mises perceptively noted in 1949, professional economists, quote, rival the legal profession in the supreme conduct of political affairs. The eminent role they play is one of the most characteristic features of our age of interventionism, unquote. And I submit to you, this is why Mises and Rothbard were, first and foremost, vocational economists. Thank you.
Agora eu vou começar então a passar as perguntas para o Joe Salerno, que está aqui, se tiver. If you have some problem with the translator, let me know. A primeira pergunta é do Cristiano Chioca, ele quer saber como é a aceitação nos dias de hoje, nas universidades americanas, dos trabalhos de Mises e Rothbard.
Well, the question, Mises and Rothbard works. I don't want to hear that. Their works are not accepted in the sense that they are on formal syllabi or the syllabus or the reading lists that the professors give out for the most part. There is no formal curriculum in Austrian economics in any university in the U.S., though there are more and more movement by individual professors to introduce Austrian ideas into the classroom, to have their students read Austrian works, to have their students consult Mises.org and read the various things that are put up, pieces that are put up there. So it's compared to 20 years ago, there is much more, let's say, informal acceptance and promotion of the Austrian school. And especially with, as Lou mentioned, the meltdown in financial markets, we find that people are searching, even academic economists are searching for answers, okay, to a phenomenon that they never expected, that they were told by central bank chairman after central bank chairman would never occur. That the U.S., or that the Federal Reserve and other central banks were in fact lenders of last resort and would always and could always perform this function. But now that that function more or less disappeared and had to be replaced by really nationalization of the financial industry to stop the meltdown, or at least to postpone it, as I said, people are looking for answers. And they're looking to Mises and Rothbard. I might mention that very recently, an eminent economist from UCLA, a very prestigious university in the United States, used Rothbard's work in talking about the Great Depression. That is, in explaining the length and depth of the Depression and unemployment during the Great Depression. And this article appeared in the Journal of Economic Theory, one of the most highly ranked journals in the U.S. So we are moving forward on all fronts in the U.S. As usual, the universities will be the last place where Austrian ideas take hold. Okay, that's because Marxist ideas haven't fully left the university system.
Vocês estão me ouvindo aqui, então? Ok. A gente tem uma pergunta do Luiz Graciano, ele quer saber o seguinte, ele gostaria de compreender as bases filosóficas da Escola Austríaca de Economia.
Okay, there are semantic differences between Mises and Rothbard on the foundations or methodological foundations of Austrian economics. But both agree, and I think most Austrian economists would agree, that the fact of human action, the fact that we all know that we use means that are scarce to us to achieve our most desired ends, that is the starting point of human action. That is called the Action Axiom. Now, Austrian economists are usually accused of not being empirical, but that is one of the most, a fact that cannot be denied by anyone. It is empirical in a very raw and very true sense. From that axiom, there are deduced many different conclusions. Now, one thing that you should keep in mind, and that is that the conclusions or the theorems of economics do not all apply to every event in the real world. So, what the economist has to do is be a good historian in the sense of looking at and positing, considering the true conditions under which action takes place. So, in the United States, we have a fractional reserve banking system. You have a lender of last resort in the form of the Federal Reserve System. Those are conditions of the real world, what Mises would call concrete conditions of action. you must integrate those into your reasoning to be able to explain the recent meltdown, for example. Okay, that is, you have to reason that there was moral hazard, that banks assumed, and other financial institutions assumed that there would be always be a bailout forthcoming if they made huge mistakes. So, to make we reason deductively, but in our chain of reasoning, we always introduce facts about the real world that are relevant to the case in hand. And that, I think, is a realistic methodology.
Oi, agora sim. O Sérgio, ele pergunta sobre as diferenças metodológicas entre, de um lado, Hayek e do outro, Mises e Rothbard, o quanto o senhor acha que elas contribuem ou atrapalham o pensamento da escola austríaca. Pode haver conciliação ou temos de escolher um caminho ou outro?
If I understand the question correctly, it asks about the disagreements between Mises and Rothbard on the one hand on methodology and Hayek on the other hand. There are differences, and they can't be denied. As Hayek grew older and developed his own system of thought, he tended to reject praxeology, or at least think it was insufficient to derive realistic economic theories. He believed that you needed, quote, a theory of learning, a theory of knowledge. Now, I disagree with that, and certainly Rothbard and Mises disagreed with that. However, I don't think those differences in methodology are as important as the similarities between Hayek on the one hand and Mises and Rothbard on the other hand. And where I think their similarities are important, and especially relevant today, is in business cycle theory, where we find Hayek developing Mises' theory. Okay. And not just developing it, but expanding it and giving it an exposition that was easier to understand in the form of structural production analysis. And then from there, Rothbard built on Hayek's structural production analysis and added new insights about the business cycle theory. One area where I do think there are relevant differences is in the socialist calculation debate, which I have written on. And there I think Hayek stressed the fact that knowledge was dispersed among different people to the exclusion of, I think, the more important problem with socialism, which Mises and Rothbard saw. And that more important problem was one of calculation. That no matter how much knowledge the central planner or the board of central planners possesses, and how much access they have to statistics, they cannot come up with, develop, or formulate a price system. Okay? One mind cannot develop a price system. A price system is developed through what Hayek, Mises called the intellectual division of labor. That is, entrepreneurs bidding for resources on the basis of what they believe are future prices. So you have entrepreneurial bidding against one another, and then we have a structure of prices that arise at every moment. And at any moment, anyone can use that structure of prices to calculate their costs and benefits, the costs and revenues, their profits and losses, and to decide, given the uncertainty of the future, whether or not they should commit their resources to a certain area of production.
Next one in English, Professor Salerno. There is a disagreement between Mises and Rothbard about ethics. To Mises, economic has not to say about the ends of an acting man. To Rothbard, the question is still open. What would you say about these economic problems? Thank you. A pergunta é do Alfredo Marcolin Peringer.
Could you just repeat the first part of the English?
Yes, there is a disagreement between Mises and Rothbard about ethics.
Yes.
Ethics. And what do you say about...
Ethics.
Yeah.
And I didn't...
To Mises, economic has not to say about the ends of an acting man, he says.
Okay. I think both Mises and Rothbard agree on one aspect, and that is that from the point of view of economics, we can't judge the ends. Okay? Now, in ethics, Rothbard believes you can rationally judge the ends. Okay? He bases himself on a theory of ethics or a theory of natural rights that goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas and further back to Aristotle. Mises, on the other hand, while he doesn't want to judge the ends, does make a judgment in some sense. And that judgment is that everyone pretty much desires prosperity, freedom, a civilized life, and so on. So he would and that's he implicitly what Rothbard would call smuggles in this ethical judgment that in some sense what the masses desire, these ends that are all pretty much uniformly desired, is right, and that we can judge economic policies in relation to this standard. I am not a philosopher. On this question, I do stand with Rothbard. I think Mises tries to import into economics ethical judgments without making explicit ethical judgments, and I don't think that you can do that in economics.
Obrigada. Eu gostaria de lembrar que vocês podem fazer perguntas também pelo microfone. Do lado direito eu tenho a Paula, do lado esquerdo eu tenho a Júlia. Vocês podem levantar a mão e simplesmente fazer a pergunta diretamente para o professor Salerno, se for o caso, por favor, não fiquem tímidos. Ali, ó, tem uma pergunta ali atrás.
Professor Salerno, o senhor é um acadêmico. E nós sabemos como Mises e Rothbard foram ignorados pelo mundo acadêmico, porque eles não estavam atrás do aplauso fácil. Aqui no Brasil, as universidades desconhecem a escola austríaca. A pergunta é, o que um estudante que gostaria de perseguir uma carreira acadêmica em economia austríaca deveria fazer?
If a person in Brazil feels a calling to follow a career in Austrian economics, and they want an academic career, I think now there are very good options. And those options are, for example, to go to Europe, where we have Jesus Huerta de Soto in Spain, and where we also have Guido Hülsmann at Angers, a French university. And as I understand it, any EU language now can be used to write one's dissertation as long as you're enrolled in 2 programs in 2 different countries. So, for example, someone from the United States can write their dissertation in English if they are enrolled both with Guido Hülsmann at Angers and Huerta de Soto in Spain. So, certainly since Portugal is an EU member, though maybe not for long, you can write your dissertation in Portuguese, I would assume. Okay, so I think that's one option. Okay, other options will become available, I think, in the United States. We have a master's degree program coming online at Grove City College for those of you who speak English. I think which will be a very good program run by Jeff Herbener. There's one other program that I wanted to mention. There's a program at the University of Detroit Mercy in which you can actually get, I guess, is it a doctorate, Lou, now, or is it just the master's? Okay. And once you have obtained your master's, then you can follow the option in Europe. Okay. Then the coursework is more or less waived because you already have done the master's, and at least thus far in Europe, many programs allow you simply to write your dissertation for the PhD once you have your master's.
Bom, eu devo lembrar que quando vocês fizerem a pergunta no microfone, o ideal é que vocês falem primeiro o seu nome e, se quiserem, uma instituição a que sejam ligados. Como eu sei que a última pergunta foi do Leandro Roque, ele é editor e tradutor do Instituto Mises Brasil, mas é bom sempre vocês se identificarem. Tem uma outra pergunta aqui. Economistas falam com tanta propriedade e convicção, com pontos de vista totalmente opostos. Afinal, é tudo uma questão de retórica? Não quis se identificar.
I think I just got a question that I wanted to avoid, and that is about the free banking debate among Austrian economists. I do not think it's just a question of rhetoric. I think here there is a real difference between Austrian economists. It should be faced openly and debated in a civil manner, and I think it has been. And that is whether on a free market we would have banks that held only a fraction of their depositors' funds in trust and lent the rest out, or banks would be forced to act as warehouses, or banks would, let me rephrase that, be contractually obliged to act as warehouses and to store the depositors' funds. One thing I would like to stress is that there's been a lot of debate on the ethical or legal point of difference between these two views. But what I have not seen much of, and what I think is beginning to happen now, is that we begin to analyze the economic aspects. I personally favor 100% reserves, so I'll reveal my bias there. And I think one of the problems with the free banking position is that, sure, anything that's consensual, people should be free to do. But I don't think that that position confronts the fact that all market activity is nested or is founded on contracts. And contracts have to be meaningful to be enforceable. That's one point. The second point is, let's say there are contracts that are made that allows only a fraction of reserves to be held, that both parties explicitly understand this is going to be the case. What we learned from the currency school and from Mises was that even banks that are free to compete against one another but only hold fractional reserves, they can cause booms. And these booms will inevitably result in busts, regardless of whether the boom is fueled by a central bank or it's fueled by simple inflation through lending of fractional reserve banks. So I think this may very well, from my point of view, be the weakness in the fractional reserve argument.
Agora eu vou fazer a última pergunta ao professor Salerno, a pergunta do Cristiano Chioca, do Instituto Mises Brasil. Ele diz o seguinte: Mises e Rothbard foram grandes system builders. O senhor vê o futuro da escola austríaca se direcionar para a especialização, para temas mais específicos, ou continuar como system builders?
That's a very good question. The questioner points out that up to this point, or up until very recently, the Austrian School of Economics has been a school of great system builders. The questioner mentions Rothbard and Mises, but of course we could say the same thing about Baumgartner and Menger. And in my opinion, this will change. Rothbard and Mises comes along once every few generations. I don't see any on the horizon, but in some sense, we don't need them right now. Okay, I'm not saying that we couldn't use the Rothbard and Mises, but what we must do now is to really catch up with their system. In other words, fill in the system and apply it to explaining economic events in this age of interventionism. So, in answer to the questioner, I do see, with more and more people coming into Austrian economics, more specialization in the good sense. That is, you know the overall system, okay, and then you use parts of the system that are relevant to apply to the various problems in the real world that need to be solved as they come up. Okay, so specialization in that sense I welcome, and I do foresee it occurring.
Thank you. Eu vou pedir aplausos para o professor Joe Salerno. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you.